The palace lies in darkness, broken only by the trembling glow of torches that stretch shadows across polished marble. Senators wait in silence, their breath shallow, their eyes fixed on the figure seated before them. Caligula appears not as a mortal ruler, but as a self-proclaimed deity, draped in gold, encrusted with jewels, crowned with laurels. His piercing stare locks the room in terror. When Caligula presided, every heartbeat carried the weight of a death sentence. Suddenly, he claps his hands, and laughter bursts from him, shrill, cutting through the silence like steel ripping flesh. Guards storm forward, dragging a child across the floor. The boy's cry echoes in the vast chamber, small hands clawing at the grip that holds him. The senators shift uneasily, horrified yet powerless, while the emperor gazes with delight. His laughter ricochets against stone as the child collapses at his feet. What followed was never recorded in detail, for words alone could not contain Caligula's cruelty. You think you know his story: banquets dripping with blood, incestuous whispers, games drenched in madness. But those are fragments. What you will hear tonight are 7 rituals so perverted that even Rome trembled to remember them. The feasts of Caligula were never gatherings of joy. They were traps, carefully staged arenas of domination, designed with the precision of a general orchestrating battle. Where other emperors displayed generosity or wealth through their banquets, Caligula weaponized his table. He transformed the dining hall into a theater of humiliation, where Rome's most powerful men were stripped of dignity under the mocking laughter of their emperor. For Rome's elite, an invitation to dine with Caligula was not an honor, but a sentence. To decline was to invite suspicion, and suspicion under Caligula was fatal. So they came, senators and nobles, wrapped in fine robes, their wives shimmering in silks and jewels, smiles painted on faces that concealed dread. Every guest knew the truth. A feast with Caligula was not survival of the fittest, it was survival of the silent. The dining hall itself glittered with spectacle. Torches burned against marble columns, shadows danced on gilded ceilings, and music floated gently above the room. Slaves moved swiftly between couches, pouring wine into silver goblets and laying down exotic delicacies, meats and fruits brought from the farthest corners of empire. At the center reclined Caligula, his robes a blur between mortal and divine, his eyes scanning not the food, but the faces and bodies of those forced to sit before him. He laughed easily, toasted the senators with mock warmth, and joined in conversation with exaggerated charm. But beneath the performance was a coiled threat. The air was tense, every word measured, every glance calculated to avoid the wrong kind of attention. Because everyone knew that at any moment the feast could shift into a nightmare. And then, without warning, Caligula struck. Sometimes it was a smirk, other times a sharp command. A senator's wife would be ordered to stand. At times, he would extend his hand with false gallantry, as though inviting her to dance. At other times, he barked her forward with a tone that left no room for refusal. The husband, helpless, pale, fists clenched beneath the table, could do nothing. To protest was defiance, and defiance was death. The emperor would lead the woman away, disappearing into an adjoining chamber. The hall fell into suffocating silence. Guests fixed their eyes on their food, their hands trembling as they lifted cups, desperate not to reveal the muffled sounds that seeped through thin walls. Every minute that passed reminded them of their powerlessness. When Caligula returned, his robe loosely tied, a grin stretched wide across his face, the room came alive again. But with forced laughter, strained voices, and humiliation cloaked in silence. He would boast in detail about what had just occurred, describing the woman's body, her supposed skill, or her failings, reducing her to ridicule before the very men who had once honored her. Her husband sat paralyzed, his honor turned to ashes, his reputation shattered. This was not indulgence. It was strategy. By publicly humiliating noble women, Caligula emasculated their husbands, the very senators who represented Rome's power. Suetonius tells us these banquets were not feasts of excess, but rehearsed performances of domination. Caligula weaponized lust, using the sanctity of marriage, Rome's cornerstone of honor, as a tool to break men's pride. For the senators, survival of exile or political defeat was possible. But public humiliation, having one's wife dragged away before one's eyes, only to be mocked in her absence, was a wound from which no reputation could recover. Rome thrived on image and dignity. Caligula reduced both to rubble with a laugh. The women endured no less torment. Reduced to trophies paraded in front of their peers, their reputations were destroyed. Resistance was impossible. A cry of outrage would bring ruin upon their families. Silence meant living as proof of disgrace. Whether noble or common, no woman was safe once she entered Caligula's hall. And it wasn't an isolated act. These banquets were frequent, a cycle of cruelty repeated until dread itself became tradition. Each new invitation carried not honor, but terror. The palace of the Caesars became a gilded snare, where music and laughter masked despair. Caligula relished this despair. He raised his cup to toast, his words dripping with mockery. He taunted men, daring them to react, delighting in their flushed faces as their wives were turned into pawns of his power. The slaves poured wine, the musicians played on, but beneath it all was suffocating silence, a silence that carried back into the streets of Rome. Rumors spread. Some dismissed them as too grotesque to believe. Others repeated them with conviction, for the senators who returned from these feasts were changed, men hollowed, broken, stripped of pride. Whether whispered in marketplaces or recorded by historians, the stories converged on one truth. These banquets were not indulgence. They were calculated acts of destruction. For Caligula, executions were not always necessary. Shame was sharper than the sword. By violating Rome's noblest women, he destroyed the honor of men who governed the empire. And by forcing those men to sit in silence, he made clear that no law, no custom, no bond of marriage could resist his will. Picture the silence after one of these spectacles. Caligula reclining in delight, narrating his conquest as the husband stares at his cup, hands trembling beneath the table. The wife sits rigid, her dignity stripped away, her shame witnessed by every peer in the room. The rest of the guests swallow hard, grateful it is not them, yet dreading when their turn will come. This was only the first ritual of Caligula's reign, a ritual that blurred the line between feast and theater, between celebration and cruelty. By turning Rome's banquets into stages of humiliation, he proved that terror could wear the mask of festivity, and that even the empire's most sacred bonds could be broken with a single gesture. If the humiliation of Rome's noblest families shattered the dignity of the Senate, what Caligula did next destroyed the very foundations of Roman morality. Because, once he had broken the city's most powerful men, he turned his gaze inward to his own blood. In Rome, family was sacred. It was the backbone of honor, the anchor of tradition, and the shield that even emperors respected. But to Caligula, family was not protection. Family was the nearest stage for his performance. Among his three sisters, Agrippina the younger, Julia Livilla, and Drusilla, one, became the centerpiece of his obsession. Drusilla was not presented to the people as a sister. She was paraded as though she were his wife. Ancient sources describe her reclining beside him at banquets, seated in the place traditionally reserved for an empress. When he appeared before crowds, she was at his side, flaunted with the pride of a man showing off his queen. To Rome, the whispers were unmistakable. Their emperor shared his bed with his own sister. Incest in Roman society was not just taboo, it was unthinkable. It was the kind of accusation hurled in slander, not spoken in truth. But Caligula didn't merely tolerate whispers, he fed them. By elevating Drusilla in public, he turned rumor into spectacle, daring the Senate and the people to look away. His message was clear. No law, no custom, no tradition was beyond his reach. The scandal grew darker still. Agrippina and Julia were not spared. Ancient accounts hint that they, too, were pulled into Caligula's orbit, forced into roles of companions, or offered to others, as if their worth existed only in their ability to entertain his cruelty. Historians disagree on the details, but the consistency of the charges tells its own story. The Romans remembered him not just as a tyrant, but as a man who desecrated the sanctity of his own bloodline. And then Drusilla died. It was the year 38 CE. For most men, the death of a beloved sibling would bring grief. For Caligula, grief became blasphemy. He did not mourn Drusilla in silence, nor bury her with honor. He declared her divine. Across Rome, Statues of Drusilla were erected, temples filled with incense not for gods of tradition, but for the emperor's dead sister. Priests were appointed to conduct sacrifices in her name. Drusilla, once a whispered scandal, was now worshipped as a goddess. Rome had deified emperors before. Julius Caesar was worshipped after death, Augustus honored as divine. But this was different. To elevate a sister, one openly treated as a consort, was grotesque in the eyes of the people. It blurred every line, family, religion, and politics fused into a single act of desecration. Even the funeral rites were unsettling. Some ancient writers suggest they carried a tone not of mourning, but of obsession. Rituals that felt unnatural, even ritualistic in ways Rome had never seen. Whether exaggerated or not, the perception lingered. Caligula did not simply love his sister. He possessed her. Even in death, she remained his object, transformed from a scandalous partner into a blasphemous goddess. For the senators, the humiliation was unbearable. These were men already broken at his banquets, forced to endure shame while their wives were paraded and mocked. Now they stood in temples, bowing their heads to a woman they knew had been both sister and consort to the emperor. To refuse was treason. To comply was degradation. Each offering of incense was not piety, it was submission. And the people whispered. They called Drusilla his true wife, his chosen partner, his obsession. They muttered about Agrippina and Julia, rumored as unwilling accomplices in his perversions. The palace, once the seat of power, was now imagined as a house of incest and sacrilege. For a society that built itself on family honor, this was more terrifying than executions. What Caligula flaunted was not hidden sin, it was deliberate theater. By parading Drusilla as his empress and elevating her to divinity after death, he dismantled Rome's deepest traditions. The sanctity of family collapsed. The sanctity of religion followed. Both became props in his grotesque performance. Picture the scene: senators gathered in solemn ritual, incense burning, prayers rising, not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to Drusilla, the emperor's dead sister. Each bowed head reflected not belief, but fear. Each whispered prayer carried not reverence, but humiliation. The empire's sacred rites twisted into mockery. This ritual, the desecration of blood, was not indulgence hidden in shadows. It was public, flaunted, forced upon Rome as though daring it to resist. Caligula blurred every boundary, mocking family, corrupting religion, and weaponizing tradition. For Rome, it was a warning. If the emperor could turn his sisters into consorts, if he could demand worship for a dead sibling as though she were divine, then nothing was beyond his reach. No law, no faith, no bond of blood could stop him. And yet, this was only the beginning. The desecration of family was not his final weapon. It was a step, a foundation. Because once Caligula had proven he could corrupt blood itself, he turned outward again, to the men who had once defined Roman dignity. And there, his cruelty would find a new stage. The Senate was supposed to be the pride of Rome, the guardians of law, tradition, and dignity. For centuries, they had advised generals, crowned emperors, and carried themselves as the embodiment of Roman authority. But under Caligula, the Senate became something else entirely. They were no longer statesmen. They were props. From the very beginning of his reign, Caligula made it clear that the Senate would not be partners in power. They would be pawns in his theater. Public ceremonies became stages of humiliation. Senators were ordered to bow until their foreheads scraped marble, groveling at his feet like slaves. Some were forced to run beside his gilded chariot, their togas heavy with sweat and dust, while Caligula rode above them, grinning like a master amused by his servants. In full view of the people, senators kissed his sandals. Their lips touched the very feet of the man who mocked them, while crowds watched in silence or laughter. With every bow, every kiss, the old dignity of the Senate disintegrated. But humiliation did not end there. Caligula forced senators into roles no Roman noble would ever dream of accepting. He commanded them to perform in the theater, dressing them in costumes, making them stumble through lines while he and his court jeered. In Roman society, acting was shameful for a man of high rank. And yet here were Rome's lawmakers, voices cracking, their faces pale, reduced to clumsy performers before the very citizens they once ruled. Some were pushed even further, forced into mock gladiatorial combats. Noble hands that once signed decrees now clutched unfamiliar weapons. They trembled under the eyes of the crowd, their togas traded for armor, their prestige replaced with fear. For the people of Rome, the spectacle was clear. The men who claimed authority were nothing more than Caligula's playthings. This was not random cruelty, it was deliberate policy. By turning senators into actors, slaves, and gladiators, Caligula destroyed their image in the eyes of the people. Executions could silence an enemy, but humiliation ensured that their reputations never recovered. Once a senator bowed in the dust or kissed the emperor's feet, he was ruined forever. His authority was stripped, his legacy shattered. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded these acts with disgust. They describe a Senate hollowed of dignity, reduced to trembling shadows of the institution it once was. Citizens, too, watched as their supposed leaders performed like clowns or stumbled in the arena. Authority shifted. No longer did Rome look to senators as figures of power. They looked to Caligula, who alone had the power to degrade or elevate. Picture the procession through Rome. Caligula rides in gleaming splendor, his chariot glittering with gold, while senators pant in the dirt beside him, their robes dragging in the dust, their faces red with shame. The crowd watches, some laughing, others silent, but all learning the same lesson. The Senate no longer ruled. Only Caligula did. Later, those same senators stumbled onto a stage, their voices cracking as they stumbled through farcical performances. Caligula leaned back, smiling, not at the play itself, but at the sight of Rome's proudest men turned into objects of mockery. For him, humiliation was entertainment, and the Senate was his stage troupe. The cruelty lay not only in the acts themselves, but in their publicity. Executions took men swiftly, but shame lingered. A senator could survive disgrace, exile, even political defeat. But how could he recover after kissing the emperor's feet before the people? How could he regain authority after being forced to act in a play, mocked like a common entertainer? He couldn't. That was the genius of Caligula's cruelty. Inside the Senate chamber, the humiliation continued. Speeches were interrupted by the emperor's mocking laughter. Debates turned into childish games, traditions reduced to ridicule. He demanded divine honors, forcing senators to worship him not merely as ruler, but as a god. Each time they obeyed, they buried their dignity deeper. They whispered in private, clenched their fists in silence, but in public they bowed. Rome's most ancient institution, once strong enough to rival kings, now trembled before one man's laughter. This was not the Senate of the Republic. This was a chorus of actors, bent and broken by humiliation. And still Caligula escalated. Humiliation was not enough unless it was creative, unless it shocked both participant and spectator. The sight of Rome's highest-born men groveling in dirt, kissing sandals, stumbling in plays, and trembling with wooden swords in the arena, this was the emperor's greatest triumph. Each act of submission was not only a performance for him, but a visible reminder to the people that no man, no matter how powerful, stood above his will. For the senators, the torment was psychological as much as physical. Every bow, every mock performance, every forced cheer for the emperor corroded their pride. Their voices broke not just from shame, but from the realization that centuries of tradition were collapsing in their hands. Caligula knew this. He designed it. Humiliation was sharper than execution. A dead man was quickly forgotten. A disgraced senator lingered in memory, his legacy destroyed, his family name stained. This was Rome's ruling class, dismantled not by swords, but by shame. If the nobility, the men who carried the weight of centuries, could be reduced to slaves, then what chance did anyone else have? If these guardians of tradition bent their heads in silence, what hope was there for common citizens? The Senate, once the heart of Rome, was now its hollow echo, and as terrifying as it was to see senators reduced to dust and laughter, Caligula was not finished. Because humiliation, as devastating as it was only one tool. His appetite demanded more. And so, having broken dignity in the Senate halls, Caligula turned to a weapon even crueler, death itself, wielded at random as if life in Rome were nothing more than a game of chance. For most rulers, executions were the grim language of justice. A man was condemned for treason, rebellion, conspiracy, or crime. Death was terrible, but it carried a reason, however thin. With Caligula, even that veil was torn away. In his Rome, death was no longer punishment. It was amusement. Survival had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It was luck, a careless glance, a tone too loud, a necklace worn in the wrong place, or even hesitation in speech. Any of these could decide whether a man lived to see another day. Caligula turned mortality into a coin toss, and the entire city became gamblers against fate. He delighted in making execution a spectacle. At times, whole rows of prisoners were lined up, trembling under the sun. Then, with no trial, no words of judgment, he would point casually, and soldiers obeyed. Sometimes every 10th man was chosen at random, the emperor smiling as blades fell. Imagine standing in that line, hearing steel slash the air beside you, knowing that survival depended not on loyalty, not on innocence, but on whether his hand turned toward you. This was not justice. This was terror perfected into performance. Caligula did not hide these killings in prisons or behind palace walls. He staged them in the open, in front of audiences, often during festivals or gatherings. While the crowd waited for a play to resume or a game to continue, he filled the pause with blood. To him, execution was not the end of entertainment. It was part of it. Parents were dragged forward to watch their children executed. Children were forced to witness their parents struck down. The air filled with cries that no theater could mask. And yet the cruelty was not only in the blade. It was in the silence afterward, in the hollow faces of those who had survived, broken not by death but by the memory of it. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio record that some guests at his banquets were pointed out suddenly and ordered to be killed before the meal was finished. At other times, citizens summoned for an audience never left the palace alive, their absence explained only by whispers. The unpredictability was the point. No one could plan, no one could prepare. And worse still, Caligula often lingered to watch. He enjoyed the moment when a man realized his fate had been sealed by whim, when eyes widened in horror as the truth set in, that he was dying not because of what he had done, but because of who ruled him. This was psychological warfare. Fear no longer followed logic, it became universal. It spread through the city like a shadow that touched every house, every family. Senators, soldiers, slaves, everyone knew they could be next. Life itself became cheap, and Rome turned into a city frozen in dread. Picture the Forum on such a day. A crowd gathers, expecting routine proceedings, when suddenly prisoners are dragged forward. The emperor raises his hand, selects one with a flick of the wrist, and steel flashes. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Some avert their eyes, others stare in disbelief. But everyone learns the same lesson. Nothing, neither status, nor wealth, nor loyalty, could protect against Caligula's will. The cruelty reached beyond the condemned. A father watched his son's blood stain the sand. A mother fell to her knees as her daughter's cries were silenced. Children stood trembling as their parents were struck down, their childhoods shattered in an instant. These were not executions meant to preserve order. They were rituals designed to break the human spirit. And rumors spread of punishments worse than death. Some accounts suggest that Caligula ordered slow tortures, beatings stretched over hours, victims sawed apart deliberately so their cries filled the air. He reveled in prolonged suffering. Death was not the goal, pain was. Even children were not spared from this cruelty, forced to see agony that seared itself into their memories. What made this terror unbearable was its randomness. Under other emperors, even the cruel ones, there was at least the pretense of cause. Accusations of conspiracy, charges of treason, suspicions of plots. Under Caligula, those excuses vanished. The machinery of state was not law or custom. It was mood. One day he spared, the next he killed. And Rome never knew which dawn would be its last. Survival no longer depended on loyalty, but on chance. Every citizen lived with the knowledge that the next gesture, the next glance, the next silence could be fatal. Rome itself became a casino of lives, where the emperor alone rolled the dice. This corrosion of order cut deeper than blood. A society lives on certainty, on rules, however flawed. But in Caligula's Rome, rules no longer existed. Fear was everywhere, order nowhere. Families locked doors, whispered their prayers, but even inside their homes they did not feel safe. And still, Caligula smiled. He watched the trembling, the silence, the hollow eyes. Fear was his favorite currency, and the price was paid daily. The more random the executions, the more power he wielded. Because when survival itself becomes uncertain, obedience is absolute. Imagine being summoned to the palace, uncertain if you would return. Imagine standing in a crowd, waiting for a festival to resume, and watching steel flash before your eyes. Imagine a world where your life depended not on your actions, but on whether the emperor's mood demanded blood. That was Caligula's Rome, a city where laughter could turn to silence in a heartbeat, a city where even the most powerful lived as though standing in line, waiting for his hand to fall. And yet, even this cruelty was not the peak, because for Caligula, executions were only one tool, one performance. Death could break a body, but humiliation could break a soul. And so, after turning life and death into a lottery, he devised an act so degrading, so scandalous, that it mocked not only individuals but Rome itself. The palace of the Caesars, the symbol of imperial power, would be transformed into something Rome had never imagined. Not a hall of law, not a throne of majesty, but a brothel. The Palatine Hill was more than a cluster of marble walls. It was Rome's sacred seat of power, the place where emperors dwelled, where authority and tradition merged into stone. For centuries, the imperial palace symbolized majesty and order. Under Caligula, it became something else entirely. It became a marketplace of shame. Ancient writers tell us that Caligula ordered sections of the palace converted into chambers of vice. Not secret rooms tucked in shadow, but openly declared brothels. And the women who filled them were not common prostitutes. They were matrons of noble families, daughters of senators, wives of Rome's ruling elite. Even men of rank were compelled to serve, dressed in mocking finery and paraded for common citizens. Visitors were summoned inside with promises of spectacle. But what they found was not ordinary indulgence. They entered the heart of the empire only to witness its nobility displayed like merchandise. Dignity was stripped from men and women alike, and Caligula stood above it all, smirking as citizens gawked at Rome's supposed guardians of virtue. This was not hidden vice. It was policy. It was strategy. Every humiliation inside those halls carried a message that no rank, no lineage, no ancient family stood higher than the emperor's whim. Imagine a senator who once governed provinces, now standing powerless as his wife was summoned to serve strangers in the emperor's palace. Picture a young man of noble blood, raised to lead legions, instead forced to entertain common citizens as though he were a slave. The humiliation was not private. It was performed, witnessed, and retold until Rome itself stank of disgrace. The Palatine, once resonant with debates and decrees, now echoed with whispers, sobs, and the mocking laughter of those who watched. What should have been the empire's temple of order became a carnival of vice, and in this carnival Caligula thrived. He did not indulge simply for pleasure. He orchestrated degradation to prove his power was limitless. Historians record that he sometimes strolled through the palace brothel, inspecting the women and men as though choosing wares. He mocked their reluctance, ridiculed their tears, and laughed at husbands who clenched their fists in helpless rage. For him, every sob, every lowered head, was proof that Rome's nobility was nothing more than property. The scandal was not a rumor whispered in shadow. Multiple sources record it. Suetonius describes matrons and nobles forced into prostitution within the palace. Dio Cassius echoes the tale, emphasizing the disbelief of citizens who realized their emperor had turned the imperial residence into a house of shame. Whether every detail is literal or not, the fact that such accounts survived speaks volumes. Rome remembered, and Rome never forgot. But as grotesque as this desecration was, it was not enough. Caligula's hunger stretched beyond bodies, beyond humiliation. He wanted more than flesh. He wanted souls. So he crossed a line even tyrants had feared to touch. He declared himself not merely emperor, but a living god. Where Julius Caesar had been deified after death, where Augustus had temples raised in his memory, Caligula demanded worship in his lifetime. Sacrifices were to be made in his name. Priests were appointed to his service. Altars burned not for Jupiter, not for Mars, but for Caligula, and it did not stop in Rome. Across the provinces, statues of the emperor were erected inside temples, sometimes beside ancient gods, other times replacing them altogether. His most reckless command was to install his image in the Temple of Jerusalem, one of the holiest sanctuaries in the ancient world. For the Jewish people, who forbade graven images, it was sacrilege of the highest order. The empire nearly erupted in revolt. Only his assassination prevented a disaster that might have torn Rome apart. In the capital, his demands grew even more outrageous. One day he dressed as Mercury, the messenger god. The next as Apollo, the sunbringer. Sometimes he adorned himself in the robes of Venus, jewels glittering against his skin as he strutted before the people as a goddess. Citizens were ordered to address him with divine titles, their voices trembling with forced devotion. But worship was not enough unless it was sincere. To hesitate, to stumble, to speak without enthusiasm could mean death. Priests rehearsed prayers like actors rehearsing lines, terrified of the smallest mistake. Every bow, every offering, every whispered invocation became a performance of survival. Picture the Senate chamber filled not with debate, but with prayers to a man in jeweled gowns. Picture citizens pouring wine at altars, their hands shaking, knowing that if they looked doubtful, they could be dragged away and executed. Rome itself became a stage where religion was no longer a matter of belief, but a test of obedience. Caligula even mocked the gods themselves, boasting that he was greater than Jupiter, greater than Mars, greater than fate. He bragged that he could kill a man and raise him again. He carried out the first half of that boast by ordering executions, then laughed that no resurrection would follow. For a society built on rituals and sacred tradition, this was more than blasphemy. It was chaos. Festivals and ceremonies that had bound Romans together for centuries were now hijacked by one man's vanity. Temples became theaters of fear. Priests became flatterers. Religion became parody. And through it all, Caligula reveled in the silence. The senators bowed, the citizens prayed, the priests obeyed, and no one dared to resist. To refuse was treason. To comply was humiliation. Every offering was less an act of worship than a reminder of submission. By the time he declared himself divine, Caligula had already destroyed dignity in the Senate, corrupted his own family, humiliated noble women, and filled the palace with scandal. But declaring himself a god pushed his cruelty into the realm of the absolute. He no longer wanted obedience alone. He wanted worship, not later, not after death, now. This ritual, this fusion of vice and divinity, was his crowning act of perversion. By turning the palace into a brothel, he mocked Rome's nobility. By forcing worship at his altars, he mocked the gods themselves. And by demanding both at once, he made clear that there was no boundary, no tradition, no force in heaven or earth that stood above him. And yet, even this desecration was not the end. For as much as Caligula delighted in humiliation, degradation, and blasphemy, his most horrific practice still waited. Not the humiliation of senators, not the desecration of family, not even the mockery of the gods. His darkest ritual was something deeper, something whispered in fragments, half-recorded, as though even the historians of Rome recoiled from putting it into words. What came next was cruelty ritualized into horror acts, so perverted that Rome itself trembled to remember them. If humiliation could break pride, and executions could break bodies, Caligula's final ritual was designed to do something even darker, to break the very soul. For him, suffering was not an accident of power, it was power itself. And so, he shaped cruelty into performance, transforming pain into ceremony. Ancient sources whisper of tortures so grotesque that even Rome, accustomed to blood in its arenas, recoiled. Caligula did not seek quick deaths. A swift sword ended too soon. Instead, he orchestrated punishments meant to stretch agony into spectacle. Victims were beaten slowly, each strike calculated not to kill, but to prolong despair. Others were sawn apart, not in haste, but inch by inch, their screams echoing through halls while the emperor reclined, smiling as though he were listening to music. What horrified Rome most was not simply the blood, but the deliberate way it was staged. Suffering was arranged like theater, pain choreographed like dance. Each gasp, each cry, was an instrument in Caligula's orchestra of terror. And it was not strangers alone who felt it. Families were destroyed in ways that scarred deeper than execution. Parents were killed before the eyes of their children, their last moments burned into memory. At other times, children were slaughtered in front of their parents, leaving mothers and fathers broken shells, alive only to carry grief as living punishment. This was cruelty sharpened into ritual, a spectacle designed not to protect power, but to revel in it. Whispers grew darker still. Some accounts suggest that during certain feasts, noble families were not merely humiliated or slain, but consumed. Historians debate the claim, unsure whether it was fact or rumor magnified by horror. But the very existence of the story tells us how Rome remembered him, not just as a tyrant, but as a monster whose appetites defied humanity itself. Imagine the palace at night. Torches flare, goblets overflow, senators sit rigid with forced smiles. Slaves bring forth dishes covered in silver lids. When the covers lift, what lies beneath is whispered to be unthinkable. Caligula watches their faces, daring them to betray fear, daring them to refuse. In that moment, rumor became more powerful than fact, because whether true or exaggerated, Rome believed it, and belief alone was enough to scar his legacy forever. Even the historians who recorded these acts struggled. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, men who wrote freely of crucifixions, of wars, of emperors steeped in scandal, hesitated here. Their words falter, their accounts fragment, as though even parchment recoiled at describing the full depth of his perversions. That silence is its own testimony. Because what Rome feared most was not that Caligula was mad, but that he was deliberate. Madness implies chaos. His acts were too precise, too ritualized. He staged suffering as if it were theater, proving that cruelty could be systematized, that horror itself could become policy. The weight of this broke Rome. Senators lived in constant dread, not only of humiliation, but of being forced to witness unspeakable horrors. Families whispered prayers behind locked doors, terrified that a single mistake might bring them to the palace of pain. Citizens carried rumors like curses, spreading fear faster than decrees ever could. And yet, Caligula strode through his palace as though immortal. Draped in jewels, crowned as a god, laughing at whispers he himself had planted, he believed himself untouchable. The torches that lit his halls no longer revealed an emperor. They revealed something else, something Rome did not have words for. But power sharpened by cruelty carries its own poison. Even those closest to him, those who bowed deepest and laughed loudest, carried silence in their eyes. Behind his back, whispers grew, not of awe, but of daggers. Senators, guards, courtiers, men who had watched him desecrate family, humiliate Rome's elite, and orchestrate ritualized horrors, had reached their breaking point. And so, in January of 41 CE, the spectacle turned against him. As he left a performance, surrounded by attendants, the plotters struck. Blades flashed in the torchlight, plunging into the body of a man who had thought himself divine. The emperor who had staged others' agony now gasped for his own breath. He who had watched parents and children broken now writhed in pain. He who had laughed at death now realized it had come for him. Guards, once sworn to defend him, stood frozen. Some say they even watched in silence, relieved that the nightmare was ending. When the final blow fell, Caligula lay lifeless on the ground. Not a god, not eternal. Just another corpse cooling on marble floors. His reign had lasted barely 4 years. Yet in that short span, he left scars that would echo for centuries. The humiliation of nobles, the desecration of family, the random executions, the palace of vice, the demand for worship, the ritualized horrors, all became etched into Rome's memory. Rome endured many cruel emperors after him, but few inspired the same shudder of revulsion. Caligula was not simply remembered as mad, he was remembered as deliberate, a man who consumed dignity, family, and tradition, feeding on suffering as though cruelty itself were a feast. Even 2,000 years later, his name remains a warning, a reminder that unchecked power does not simply corrupt, it perverts. It twists humanity into theater, tradition into mockery, and suffering into ritual. If this glimpse into the darkest chapter of Rome has left you shaken, there are more hidden shadows waiting. Click the video on your screen now to uncover the next story history tried to bury. And if you want to continue this journey through the forgotten horrors of the past, like, subscribe, and join me as we keep pulling secrets from the shadows.